Did you enjoy the adjustments I made for you, Mom? My son asked, as if he were talking about something simple, something ordinary, like fixing a leaky faucet or repainting a room. And I remember the exact moment my hand stopped halfway to my coffee mug because there was something in the way he said it that didn't sit right with me. Something too casual for a question that carried a weight I couldn't yet name. So I looked at him across the table and said quietly, "What adjustments?" And for a brief second, just a second, I saw it, the flicker in his eyes, the hesitation that shouldn't have been there. And then it was gone, replaced by a polite smile that didn't quite reach his face. And before he could answer, Emily stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Her expression composed, almost too composed, the kind of calm that feels rehearsed, and she placed her hand lightly on his shoulder as if to steady him, or maybe to remind him of something unspoken, and I felt a small, unfamiliar chill settle in my chest, the kind that doesn't come from the weather but from a thought you don't want to finish, and I told myself I was overthinking, that at 68 you start to notice things that aren't really there, that memory plays tricks, that time softens details and reshapes them into something unfamiliar. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't ignore the quiet question forming somewhere deeper, somewhere more certain, because I had always trusted my memory, always relied on it to hold the shape of my life together. And now suddenly something didn't match, something didn't line up the way it should have, and the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it pressed forward, subtle but persistent, like a loose thread you can't stop pulling. And I realized then that this wasn't about one question or one moment at the breakfast table. It was about a series of small things I had brushed aside over the past year, little details that hadn't seemed important at the time, letters that never arrived, phone calls that felt shorter than they used to, documents that I thought I had seen but couldn't quite place anymore, and I had explained each one away when it happened, told myself it was nothing, that life changes, that families grow and shift and sometimes drift. But now, sitting there with my son watching me too carefully and my daughter-in-law standing just close enough to control the space between us, I felt something settle into place with a quiet certainty that surprised me, because this wasn't confusion, it wasn't age, it wasn't forgetfulness, it was a pattern, and patterns don't form by accident, they build slowly, deliberately, one small piece at a time until suddenly you can't ignore them anymore. And I remember nodding as if I understood, as if his question had been answered even though it hadn't, because something told me not to press, not yet, that whatever this was, it was bigger than a single conversation, bigger than a single explanation, and I needed to see it clearly before I spoke, before I reacted, because I had spent most of my life responding too quickly, smoothing things over, keeping peace where it didn't belong, and this time felt different. This time felt like something that required patience. And later that afternoon, when the house was quiet again and the sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor in that familiar late-day way, I found myself standing in front of the cabinet where I kept my documents, the ones I had organized years ago after my husband passed, each folder labeled in my own careful handwriting, everything in its place, everything exactly as I remembered it. And yet as I opened the drawer and ran my fingers along the edges of those folders, I felt that same subtle unease return, that same quiet insistence that something had shifted when I wasn't looking. And I pulled out the first file, then another, then a third, telling myself I was just checking, just being thorough, just making sure everything was where it should be. But the truth was, I was looking for something I couldn't yet name, something I hadn't consciously lost but somehow knew was missing. And as I began to read through the documents line by line, date by date, I noticed small things at first, details that didn't quite align with my memory, signatures that felt unfamiliar, numbers that seemed slightly off, changes so subtle they could almost be explained away if you didn't look too closely. And for a moment I considered doing exactly that, closing the folder, putting everything back, telling myself it didn't matter, that it was easier not to know. But then I paused, my hand resting on the edge of the paper, and I realized something that changed the way I saw everything in that moment, because the details weren't random, they weren't mistakes, they were consistent in a way that made them impossible to ignore. And that was when I understood, not fully, not yet, but enough to know that what I was looking at wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something intentional, something that had been carefully put into place while I trusted that everything was exactly as I had left it. And I remember sitting down slowly, the quiet of the house pressing in around me, and thinking, not with fear, not even with anger, but with a calm clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, that if my memory no longer matched what was in front of me, then either my memory was failing, or someone had made sure it would seem that way. And deep down, in a place I couldn't ignore anymore, I already knew which one it was. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind would not let go of the quiet inconsistencies I had uncovered, the kind that do not shout for attention but instead settle into your thoughts and refuse to leave. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying moments I had once considered ordinary, small conversations, brief visits, passing comments that had seemed harmless at the time, and now each one felt slightly different, like a photograph that had been altered just enough to make you question what you remembered seeing in the first place. And by morning, I had already made a decision without ever saying it out loud, because I knew that if I asked directly, if I confronted Daniel or Emily without understanding the full picture, I would only be given explanations that sounded reasonable but answered nothing, and I had lived long enough to recognize the difference between an answer and a distraction. So instead, I moved quietly through my routine, making coffee, opening the windows, letting in the cool air of the early morning, all the while keeping my thoughts steady, controlled, because this was not a moment for emotion, it was a moment for clarity, and clarity required patience. So I returned to the cabinet again, this time more deliberate, more focused, and I began organizing the documents not as they were, but as I remembered them, aligning dates, comparing signatures, tracing back small details that I had once trusted. Without question, and it did not take long before the pattern became clearer, the changes were not random, they followed a timeline, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, then gradually more defined, and I noticed that the earliest discrepancies appeared about a year after my husband passed, around the time when Emily had started helping me manage certain things, as she had called it, offering to sort through paperwork, to make sure everything was up to date, to handle the more complicated details so that I would not have to worry. And at the time I had been grateful, because grief has a way of making even simple tasks feel overwhelming, and I had trusted her willingness to step in, trusted the calm efficiency she presented, trusted the way Daniel seemed relieved that someone was taking care of things, and now, sitting there with the documents spread out in front of me, I realized how easily that trust had created an opening. Not a dramatic one, not something obvious, but something gradual, something that could be shaped over time without drawing attention. And I remember picking up one particular statement, a financial summary I was certain I had reviewed months ago, and reading it slowly, carefully, noticing that the figures did not match what I remembered, not by a large amount, not enough to raise immediate concern, but enough to create a quiet unease. And I turned the page, then another, comparing it to older records, and there it was again, a small shift, a slight adjustment, consistent enough to suggest intention but subtle enough to pass unnoticed if you were not looking for it. And I felt a strange calm settle over me as I continued, because with each detail I uncovered, the uncertainty I had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by something more solid, more certain, and I realized that what I was experiencing was not confusion, it was recognition, the kind that comes when pieces that once seemed unrelated begin to form a complete picture. And I thought about the times Emily had asked me to sign documents quickly, assuring me they were routine, the times Daniel had mentioned updates in passing without offering specifics, the times I had chosen not to ask questions because I believed there was no reason to doubt them, and now those moments felt different, not alarming, not yet, but purposeful in a way I could no longer ignore, and I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of the house settle around me again, and considered what I knew and what I still needed to confirm, because knowing something is wrong is not the same as proving it, and if there was one thing I understood clearly now, it was that whatever had been done, carefully, deliberately, in a way that relied on my trust and my willingness not to question, and that meant I needed to be just as careful in how I moved forward. So I gathered the documents neatly, placing them back into their folders with the same precision I had always used, restoring the appearance of order even though I now knew it was only that, an appearance, and as I closed the cabinet, I felt a quiet resolve take hold, not driven by anger or betrayal, but by a simple, steady determination to see this through, to understand exactly what had been changed when it had started, and most importantly why, because whatever the answer was, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would not find it by asking, I would find it by watching, by listening, and by paying attention to the details they believed I would never question. I waited 3 days before I saw them again, not because I needed the time, but because I wanted the moment to feel ordinary, unforced, the kind of setting where people reveal more than they intend simply because they believe nothing is being questioned. And when Daniel called to invite me over for dinner that Sunday evening, his voice light and casual, I accepted without hesitation, keeping my tone just as warm as it had always been, because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that nothing would be gained by changing my behavior too quickly. So I arrived at their house just before 6, the same way I had done countless times before, carrying a small dish I had prepared that afternoon, something simple, something familiar, and Emily greeted me at the door with that same composed smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes, and I noticed how quickly her gaze moved past me, as if she were measuring something, checking for signs, and I smiled back, just as calm, just as steady, stepping inside and letting the evening unfold the way they expected it to, because I wanted to see what would happen when they believed everything was still exactly as they had arranged it. And dinner began like any other, quiet conversation, polite laughter, the soft clink of silverware against plates. But beneath it all, I could feel the subtle tension that had not been there before, not obvious, not enough for anyone else to notice, but present in the way Daniel avoided certain topics, in the way Emily guided the conversation whenever it drifted too close to anything related to finances or the house, and I let them do it. I let the conversation move exactly where they wanted it to go, because I was not there to control the moment, I was there to observe it, and halfway through the meal, I set my fork down gently and said, as casually as I could, that I had been going through some of my paperwork recently, just organizing things, making sure everything was up to date, and I watched them carefully, not their words but their reactions, the small shifts that happened before a response is formed, and Daniel paused, just for a fraction of a second, his hand tightening slightly around his glass before he took a sip, and Emily smiled that same controlled smile, and asked what I had found, her tone light but her posture just a little too still, and I shrugged, keeping my expression thoughtful but unconcerned, and said that I had noticed a few things that did not quite match what I remembered, nothing major, just small details that seemed off, and for a moment the room felt quieter, not silent, but as if the air itself had shifted, and Daniel glanced at Emily quickly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to see, and she gave the smallest nod, the kind that would go unnoticed if you were not looking for it, and then she spoke, explaining that paperwork can be confusing, especially after so many years, that updates are made, adjustments happen, things are streamlined to make everything easier, and her words were smooth, practiced, each sentence fitting neatly into the next, but there was something missing in them, something that did not quite answer what I had said, and I nodded as if it made sense, as if I accepted the explanation without question, and I let the conversation move on, shifting to lighter topics, asking about their week, their plans, anything that would restore the appearance of normalcy, because I had seen enough for one evening, and as we cleared the table and moved into the living room, I continued to watch, noticing the way Emily kept her phone close, the way Daniel seemed slightly distracted, as if his thoughts were elsewhere, and I realized then that whatever had been done, it was not something they expected to be challenged, not yet, and that meant I still had time to gather more, time to confirm what I had begun to suspect, and when I left later that night, Emily hugged me lightly, her voice warm as she said we should do this again soon, and Daniel walked me to my car. His expression softer now, almost reassuring, as if nothing had changed, and I smiled at him, just as I always had, telling him to take care, to call me during the week, all the small things that keep a relationship looking intact, and as I drove home, the streetlights passing steadily through the windshield, I replayed the evening in my mind, not the words but the pauses, the glances, the quiet signals they did not realize they were giving, and by the time I pulled into my driveway I no longer felt uncertain about what I had seen, because it was not just in the documents anymore, it was in them, in the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they avoided certain truths without ever naming them, and as I sat there for a moment before going inside, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They were not confused, they were not mistaken, they were careful, and if they were being careful, then whatever they were hiding was worth protecting, which meant it was worth finding, and this time I would not rely on memory alone. I would rely on what they revealed when they thought I was no longer paying attention. The next morning, I did not rush into anything, because rushing would mean reacting, and reacting would mean giving them the advantage of seeing where I stood, and that was something I was no longer willing to do. So instead I moved through my day with the same quiet rhythm I had always kept, making breakfast, watering the plants, letting the hours pass without urgency, but underneath that calm routine my thoughts remained sharp, focused on the pieces I had already gathered and the ones I still needed to find, and by late morning, I found myself sitting at the small desk in the corner of my living room, the one I had shared with my husband for years, where we used to sort through bills together, discuss plans, make decisions that shaped our life one careful step at a time, and for a moment I allowed myself to remember how things had been then, how nothing was hidden, how every document, every number, every signature had been something we both understood. And that memory did not make me emotional, it made me precise because it reminded me that I knew exactly how things were supposed to look, which meant I could recognize when they did not, and I began pulling out older records, ones I had not touched in years, going back further than I had before, comparing not just recent changes but the original structure of everything, and it became clear very quickly that what I had seen so far was only part of the story, because the foundation itself had not changed, only the layers built on top of it, small adjustments added over time, each one subtle enough to avoid attention, but together forming something entirely different from what I remembered, and I noticed that certain accounts had been consolidated, others reclassified, language in the documents slightly altered in ways that shifted meaning without drawing notice, and I realized that whoever had done this understood exactly how to make changes without triggering suspicion, because nothing had been removed outright, nothing had been taken in a way that would cause immediate alarm, instead it had been redirected, repositioned, quietly moved under a different structure, and I leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle because it told me something important. This was not careless, it was deliberate, and that meant there would be a trail, not an obvious one, but one that could be followed if I knew where to look. And I thought about the timeline again, about when Emily had started taking a more active role in handling these matters, about how naturally it had happened, how easily I had accepted her help, and I remembered specific moments now with greater clarity, times when she had suggested simplifying certain accounts, times when she had offered to handle communications with advisors or institutions, always presenting it as a way to make things easier for me, and I had agreed because it had seemed reasonable, because I had trusted her, and because I had not seen any reason not to, and now those same moments felt different, not because they were dramatic but because they were consistent, each one aligning with the pattern I was beginning to see, and I realized then that the next step was not just to review what I had, but to verify it, to see how it existed outside of my own records. So I picked up the phone and dialed the number of the bank I had worked with for years, the same branch, the same institution, a place where my name should still carry recognition, and when the representative answered, I kept my tone calm, polite, explaining that I wanted to confirm a few details about my accounts, nothing urgent, just routine verification, and as I provided my information and waited for her to pull up the records, I felt a quiet steadiness settle in, because this was no longer about suspicion, it was about confirmation, and when she began to read back the account summaries, I listened carefully, comparing each detail to what I had in front of me, and at first everything sounded consistent, the balances, the account types, the general structure, but then as she continued, she mentioned an account designation that I did not recognize, not because it was unfamiliar in name, but because it was not something I had ever authorized in the way she described it, and I asked her to repeat it, keeping my voice even, as if it were simply a matter of clarification, and she did, explaining that the account had been updated to reflect a different management arrangement, one that allowed for certain transactions to be handled through an authorized secondary party, and I felt that same quiet stillness return, not shock, not confusion, but recognition, because this was the first time I had heard it stated clearly, not implied through documents or behavior, but confirmed through an external source, and I thanked her, asking a few more neutral questions before ending the call, and as I set the phone down, I did not feel overwhelmed, I did not feel betrayed in the way people often describe it. Instead I felt something much more controlled, much more precise, because now I knew that the changes were not just internal adjustments, they were formal, recognized, and that meant they had been put in place with intention, and as I looked down at the documents spread across my desk, I understood that I was no longer searching for inconsistencies, I was tracing a system, one that had been carefully built while I believed everything remained exactly as it had always been, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to think one step ahead, not just about what had been done, but about what they believed I would do next, and I realized that their confidence depended on one simple assumption, that I would either not notice or if I did, that I would question myself before I questioned them, and as I gathered the papers together once more, placing them back into their folders with deliberate care, I understood that this assumption was about to become their greatest mistake. I did not call Daniel that day, and I did not mention anything to Emily because there is a difference between knowing something is wrong and deciding how to respond to it, and I was no longer interested in reacting the way they expected me to, so instead I sat quietly in my living room that afternoon, the sunlight stretching across the floor in long familiar lines, and I began thinking not about what had already been done but about what it meant, because the presence of an authorized secondary party on my accounts was not a small detail, it was a structure, something that required intention, paperwork, verification, and most importantly my supposed consent, And that was the part that stayed with me because I could not remember ever agreeing to such an arrangement, not in the way it had been described, and I trusted that instinct more than anything else, so rather than question it immediately, I asked myself a different question: when would this have been put into place? And as I traced the timeline again, aligning it with the documents and the changes I had already identified, a clearer picture began to form, one that pointed back to a specific period, the months following my husband's passing, when everything had felt heavier, slower, when decisions had been made quickly because they needed to be, when I had relied more on others simply because I had to. And I remembered now how often Emily had stepped in during that time, how she had sat beside me with papers spread out across the table, explaining things in a calm, reassuring tone, guiding me through what she described as necessary updates, and I had listened not because I could not understand, but because I had trusted her intention, trusted that she was helping, and now looking back I realized that those moments had not been random, they had been opportunities, carefully used, carefully managed, and I felt a quiet clarity settle in as I accepted that this had not happened overnight. It had been built step by step, each decision layered on top of the last until it became something solid, something that would not easily be questioned, and that meant undoing it would require more than suspicion. It would require evidence, something undeniable, something that could not be explained away with a calm voice and a practiced smile, and I understood then that I needed someone who was not part of this, someone who had no reason to protect them or their version of events, someone who had seen the original structure of everything before these changes had been made. And there was only one person who fit that description, the attorney who had handled my husband's estate, a man who had known us both for years, who had worked with us when everything was still clear, still aligned with our intentions, and I had not spoken to him in some time, not because there was any reason to, but because I had believed everything was already settled, already in order. And now as I reached for my phone again, I felt that same steady focus guiding me, not urgency, not hesitation, just a clear next step. And when I dialed his number I kept my voice even, introducing myself, explaining that I wanted to review a few things related to the estate, nothing complicated, just a matter of confirmation. And when he recognized my name his tone shifted slightly, warmer, more familiar, and he agreed to meet with me later that week. And as I ended the call I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not yet, but direction, because for the first time since this had begun, I was no longer looking at scattered pieces. I was moving toward someone who could see the full picture, someone who could tell me not just what had changed, but what had been intended from the beginning. And as the evening settled in and the house grew quiet again, I prepared dinner the way I always did, moving through the motions with a calm precision that felt almost automatic, but my thoughts remained clear, focused on the meeting ahead, on the questions I would ask, on the answers I expected to hear. And I realized something then that surprised me, because I was not afraid of what I might discover. I was ready for it, ready to see the truth laid out plainly, without interpretation, without explanation, just facts. And that realization brought with it a sense of control I had not felt in days, because whatever they had built depended on my silence, on my willingness to accept things as they were presented, and that silence was no longer something they could rely on. And as I sat at the table later that night, the quiet surrounding me once again, I understood that this was no longer about whether something had been taken or changed. It was about understanding how far it had gone, how carefully it had been arranged, and most importantly, whether they believed it would never be questioned. And I let that thought settle, not with anger, but with a calm certainty that felt stronger than anything else, because if they believed I would never question it, then they had already underestimated me, and that was a mistake I intended to let them keep making, at least for a little while longer. I arrived at the attorney's office 10 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted the time to settle into the space, to observe it the way I now observed everything, carefully, without drawing attention. And as I sat in the waiting area, I noticed how little had changed since the last time I had been there with my husband: the same muted carpet, the same framed certificates on the walls, the same quiet professionalism that made everything feel structured and reliable. And for a brief moment I allowed that familiarity to steady me, because it reminded me of a time when things were clear, when decisions were made with intention and documented with precision. And when the receptionist finally called my name, I stood calmly and followed her down the hallway, my steps measured, my thoughts focused not on what I feared, but on what I needed to confirm. And when I entered his office, he greeted me warmly, his expression genuine, not rehearsed, and as we sat across from each other, I noticed the way he studied me for a moment, as if sensing that this was not a routine visit, and I began simply, explaining that I had been reviewing my records and wanted to ensure that everything aligned with the original estate plan. Nothing more, nothing less, and he nodded, reaching for a file drawer behind him, pulling out a folder with my husband's name on it, and as he placed it on the desk between us, I felt a quiet shift inside me, because this was the first time I was about to see the structure as it had been intended, untouched by the changes I had begun to uncover, and he opened the folder, flipping through the documents with practiced ease, explaining each section in clear, direct terms, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, allowing him to present the information as he understood it, because I wanted to hear it without influence, without leading him toward any particular conclusion, and as he described the original arrangements, the distribution of assets, the management structure, the safeguards that had been put in place, I noticed something immediately, something that did not align with what I had been told by the bank, because there was no mention of any secondary authorization that allowed another party to manage or redirect anything without my explicit, ongoing approval, and I let him finish before I spoke, asking calmly if there had been any updates, any amendments filed after the initial documents were executed. And he paused, considering the question carefully before turning back to the file and reviewing it again, more slowly this time, and after a moment, he shook his head, explaining that no formal amendments had been submitted through his office, that everything remained as it had been originally structured, and I felt that same quiet clarity return, because this confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that whatever changes had been made were not part of the official plan, not something that had been properly documented within the framework that had been designed to protect me, and I asked one more question then, keeping my tone steady, asking whether it was possible for someone to gain a level of access or control without a formal amendment, and he leaned back slightly, considering the scenario, explaining that while certain permissions could be granted through financial institutions for convenience, those permissions were typically limited and required clear authorization, and more importantly, they did not override the original intent of the estate unless they were supported by formal documentation. And I nodded, thanking him, allowing the conversation to move to more general topics before bringing it to a close, because I had heard what I needed to hear, and as I left the office and stepped back into the afternoon light, I felt no confusion, no uncertainty, only a steady understanding that what had been done existed outside the boundaries of what had been intended, and that meant it had been constructed carefully, quietly, in a space where oversight was minimal and trust was assumed, and as I walked to my car, I realized that the pieces were no longer scattered. They were connected, forming a clear outline of something that had been built step by step while I believed everything remained secure, and as I sat behind the wheel, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, I allowed myself a moment to consider the full weight of what I now knew, not in terms of loss or betrayal, but in terms of strategy, because understanding how something was done is what allows you to undo it, and more importantly, to reveal it. And I understood now that whatever role Emily had played in this, it had not been accidental. It had required planning, consistency, and a belief that I would never look closely enough to notice. And as I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, I felt that same quiet resolve settle in once again, because now I was no longer searching for answers, I was preparing to expose them, and this time I would not rely on memory, I would rely on what could not be denied. When I got home that afternoon, I did not go back to the documents right away, because there was no need to keep searching for something I had already found. Instead, I sat quietly in my living room, hands folded in my lap, letting everything I had learned settle into something clear and usable, because knowledge without control is just noise, and I was no longer interested in noise. I was interested in precision, in understanding exactly how they believed this would end, and more importantly, how they believed I would behave. And that was when I saw it clearly for the first time, not just the changes, not just the structure, but the assumption behind it all, because everything they had done depended on one simple belief, that I would either not notice, or if I did, that I would question myself before I questioned them, that I would doubt my own memory, my own judgment, my own understanding of things I had managed for decades. And I let that thought sit for a moment, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet clarity that made everything feel simpler than it had before. Because once you understand the assumption someone is relying on, you also understand how to dismantle it, and I realized then that confronting them directly would only confirm their expectation. It would turn me into exactly what they had planned for, someone confused, emotional, easy to redirect, and that was not a role I was willing to play, not anymore. So instead I stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen, and began preparing a simple cup of tea, the same way I had done countless times before, letting the familiar rhythm guide me. Because sometimes the most ordinary actions are the ones that give you the space to think clearly, And as I stood there waiting for the water to heat, I began to consider what they had not prepared for, what they had not accounted for in whatever careful plan they had constructed. And the answer came to me in a way that felt almost obvious once I saw it. They had not prepared for me to step outside the role they had assigned me. They had not prepared for me to observe instead of react, to verify instead of assume, to remain silent instead of asking questions too soon. And that meant I still had the advantage, even now, even after everything that had already been done. And I carried that thought with me as I moved through the rest of the evening, setting the table, eating dinner, cleaning up, all of it done with the same steady calm that had defined my life for years. But underneath that calm, there was something different now, something sharper, more deliberate, and I began to plan not in broad strokes, not in emotional reactions, but in specific steps, because if they had built something carefully, then I would need to take it apart just as carefully. And the first step was simple. I needed them to believe that nothing had changed, that I had noticed nothing, that I was still exactly who they thought I was, because that belief would keep them relaxed, it would keep them predictable, and predictability is what allows you to see clearly. So the next morning I picked up the phone and called Daniel, my voice warm steady, asking how he was, making light conversation the way I always had, and when he answered he sounded normal, almost relieved, as if whatever tension had existed at dinner a few nights before had faded. And I spoke to him about ordinary things, the weather, a recipe I had tried, small details that carried no weight, and I listened to his responses, not just what he said, but how he said it, the ease in his tone, the absence of hesitation, and I realized that from his perspective, everything was still in place, nothing had shifted, nothing had been questioned, and that confirmed what I needed to know, that whatever concerns had surfaced during that dinner had been dismissed, explained away, contained. And I ended the call gently, telling him I would see him soon. And as I set the phone down, I felt no urgency. No need to act immediately, because this was not about speed, it was about timing, and timing requires patience. And later that day, I did something I had not done in a long time. I reviewed not just the documents, but the spaces around them, the small details that are often overlooked, the envelopes, the timestamps, the subtle indications of when something had been handled and by whom, because if there was a system in place, it would leave traces, not obvious ones, but consistent ones. And as I moved through those details, I began to see patterns that extended beyond the numbers, beyond the signatures, into the rhythm of how things had been managed, when certain changes appeared, when communications shifted, and it became clear that this had not been a single action, it had been a process, something maintained over time, something that required attention, and that meant it was still active, still ongoing. And I paused then, letting that realization settle, because it changed the nature of everything. This was not something that had happened and ended. It was something that was still in motion. And as I sat back in my chair, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the room, I understood that whatever I did next would not just reveal what had been done, it would interrupt it. And that was something they had not planned for. And I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not out of satisfaction but out of certainty, because for the first time since this began, I was not reacting to their actions, I was preparing to shape what came next, and this time, I would be the one deciding how the story unfolded. I chose the following evening carefully, not because it was special, but because it was ordinary, and ordinary moments are where people reveal the most, when they believe nothing is being tested. So I invited Daniel and Emily over for dinner, my voice warm on the phone, my tone unchanged, as if everything between us remained exactly as it had always been, and they accepted without hesitation, which told me more than they realized, because there was no caution in their response, no sense that anything had shifted, and that was exactly what I needed. So I spent the afternoon preparing the meal with the same attention I always had, setting the table with care, arranging everything in its place, not as a performance but as a signal, because consistency creates comfort, and comfort lowers defenses. And when they arrived just before 6, Emily stepped in first, her smile polite and measured, Daniel following just behind her, his demeanor relaxed, and I welcomed them in as I always did, offering them drinks, guiding them into the familiar rhythm of conversation, letting the evening unfold naturally, because nothing I was about to do required urgency, it required precision. And as we sat down to eat, I allowed the conversation to move through its usual patterns, light topics, shared memories, small observations that carried no weight, and I listened, not just to their words, but to the ease in their voices, the absence of hesitation, the quiet confidence that comes from believing everything is under control. And it was only after the plates had been cleared and we had moved into the living room that I introduced the shift, subtle, almost incidental, mentioning that I had been thinking about simplifying a few things, organizing my accounts, making everything easier to manage moving forward, and I watched them closely because this was the moment that mattered, not what I said but how they responded to it, and Daniel nodded immediately, agreeing that it was a good idea, his tone supportive, almost encouraging, while Emily leaned forward slightly, her interest sharpening just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention, and she asked what I had in mind, her voice smooth, controlled, and I smiled lightly as if the idea were still forming, explaining that I was considering consolidating everything into a more streamlined structure, something that would make it easier to track and manage without confusion, and I paused then, just long enough to let the idea settle, just long enough for them to process what it might mean, and in that pause I saw it, the brief exchange between them, the quick glance, the subtle tightening in Emily's posture, the way Daniel's hand shifted slightly against his knee, and it was not fear, not exactly, but it was awareness, the kind that appears when something unexpected enters a situation you believed was predictable, and I continued calmly, adding that I might speak with the bank again just to make sure everything was aligned properly, nothing urgent, just routine, and this time Emily responded first, her voice still composed but carrying a slightly sharper edge, suggesting that it might not be necessary, that everything had already been set up efficiently, that making changes could complicate things unnecessarily, and I nodded as if her point made sense, as if I appreciated her concern, but I did not agree or disagree, I simply let the idea remain open, and as the conversation shifted away from it, I knew what I needed to know, because their reactions had confirmed something that no document alone could prove, that the structure I had begun to uncover was not just in place, it was being protected, actively, carefully, and that meant I was no longer dealing with something passive, something that had simply been left as it was. I was dealing with something that required maintenance, something that could be disrupted, and as the evening came to an end and they prepared to leave, Emily hugged me lightly, her smile returning to its usual calm, but there was a tension beneath it now, something she could not entirely hide, and Daniel thanked me for dinner, his voice steady, but his eyes searching my face for something, perhaps a sign, perhaps a confirmation, and I gave him neither, only the same gentle smile I had always offered, because the most important part of this was not what I revealed, it was what I allowed them to believe, and as I closed the door behind them and the house fell quiet once again, I walked back into the living room and sat down slowly, letting the silence settle around me, and I understood then that the next step would not be about discovering anything new, it would be about timing, about choosing the moment when what I already knew would carry the greatest weight, and for that, I needed them to remain exactly as they were, confident, composed, unaware of how much had already shifted, because the moment they realized that everything would change and I intended to be ready when it did. The following morning, I woke up with a clarity that did not need to be forced, because everything I had seen, everything I had confirmed, had already settled into something steady and complete, and I did not feel the need to revisit it again, to question it again, because there was nothing left to question, only something left to reveal, and as I moved through my routine, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the quiet light fill the room, I understood that this would be the day I shifted from observation to action, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would draw attention too early, but in a way that would make the truth undeniable when it finally surfaced, and I began by gathering the documents I had reviewed, not all of them, only the ones that mattered, the ones that showed the pattern clearly, the ones that aligned with what the bank had confirmed and what the attorney had explained, and I placed them neatly into a single folder, organizing them in a way that told the story without needing explanation, because facts, when presented correctly, do not need interpretation, they speak for themselves. And once everything was in place, I picked up the phone and called Daniel again, my voice calm, steady, asking if he and Emily would come by later that afternoon, telling him I had something important I wanted to go over, nothing urgent, just something I thought we should review together, and there was a brief pause on the other end of the line, not long enough to draw attention but long enough for me to recognize it, and then he agreed, his tone careful but still controlled, and as I ended the call, I felt no tension, no anticipation, only a quiet readiness, because I knew exactly how this would unfold, not every word, not every reaction, but the structure of it, the way truth reveals itself when there is nowhere left for it to hide. And when they arrived that afternoon, there was a difference in the air, subtle but present, not the ease of the previous evening, but something more cautious, more aware, and I welcomed them in the same way I always had, offering them a seat, moving into the living room where the light fell evenly across the space, creating a sense of openness that left very little room for distraction, and I sat across from them, the folder resting quietly on the table between us, and for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because they were waiting, trying to understand what this was about before I gave it shape. And I let that moment stretch just long enough to settle, just long enough for the weight of it to become noticeable, and then I spoke, not with accusation, not with emotion, but with calm clarity, explaining that I had been reviewing my records carefully, that I had taken the time to understand how everything was structured, and that I had also confirmed those details with both the bank and the attorney. And as I said this, I watched them closely because this was where the shift would happen, not in my words, but in their reactions to them, and Daniel's posture changed almost immediately, his shoulders tightening slightly, his expression becoming more focused, while Emily remained still, her composure intact but her eyes sharper now, more alert, and I opened the folder slowly, turning it toward them, allowing them to see the documents without immediately explaining them because I wanted them to recognize what they were looking at before I guided them through it, and I pointed to the first page, then the next, tracing the timeline I had already pieced together, showing the small adjustments, the consistent pattern, the alignment between what had been changed and what had been confirmed externally, and I did not rush. I did not raise my voice, I simply presented the information exactly as it existed, and for a moment neither of them spoke because there was nothing immediate to say, no simple explanation that could dismiss what was in front of them, and I could see it then, not in words, but in the way Emily's hand moved slightly, resting against the edge of the table, the way Daniel's gaze shifted between the documents and my face, searching for something, perhaps a sign of uncertainty, perhaps a sign that this could still be redirected. And I met his gaze calmly, not challenging, not accusing, just steady, and in that moment I understood something that brought everything into focus, because the power in that room had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, and I closed the folder gently, resting my hands on top of it, and said in the same calm tone I had used from the beginning that I was not confused, that I was not mistaken, and that I understood exactly what had been done and how it had been done, and I let that settle between us, not as a threat, not as a demand, but as a statement of fact, and as the silence stretched, I saw it clearly, the moment they realized that the role they had assigned me no longer applied, that the assumptions they had relied on were no longer valid, and I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, because everything that came next would unfold from this point forward, and for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting to their actions, I was defining the outcome, and I knew with a certainty that did not need to be spoken, that whatever they had believed about me, whatever they had counted on, had just become their first and most significant mistake.